Yep, it's audible. Thanks.
Okay, amazing. Ben, for PIs, either turn on your camera or raise your hand in Zoom. It's fine. For a country which biggest problem at any given time is either having too much or too little water, we think that it's the right time and the right opportunity for us to have a department that manages, that creates strategic planning, and to better manage the water systems that exist in the Philippines. The first thing in framing is I want to argue and I want to show to you what this creation likely will look like in status quo. The first is this is probably going to be an executive department, right? Something like a Department of Water that exists in the Philippines. So this is like this is like DPWH, this is like DOH, and this is like Department of Agriculture, right? So it's that same kind of level. But how this will likely to happen is that it's likely to happen in a timeline. That is to say, the existing agencies now, like the NIA, for example, aren't going to immediately cease to exist in the event that we create a department. We say that we give them enough time, for example, to transition their projects, to turn over their projects, and to complete their projects to ensure that there's continuity, precisely because it's just unreasonable for us to abruptly end everything, right? So there's going to be, there's going to be a transition. But the next is the current way that this will likely be formed is that the existing agencies now, such as NIA, this is the waterways and sewers and the irrigation one, right? It's likely going to be absorbed under an umbrella department where they're likely to just be sub-departments within the Department of Water. That is to say that they're going to absorb one, the manpower from these within these groups, but second, the funding as well. So the difference on our world is that we get a more assured funding precisely because we're in the budget hearing versus on them, where they have to depend on the DPWH and DENR for funding in as much as their mere dependence and sign-offs. That is why it's better on our world. What it does then is one, it creates better strategic planning for cross-disciplinary functions that exist within these different departments. Second is a higher certainty of funding, but also a higher degree of accountability in as much as there's already a clear chain of command and levels of accountability that we can scrutinize on as the public, for example, as the news media, or as different government agencies that are actively looking into how we're managing water in the Philippines. That is precisely why it's better. I want to then give what is the incentive of the state to do this creation of the department well, and what is their capacity to do so. The first is, obviously, the creation of a new executive department is likely to create a fixed cost. That means it takes a while to recuperate the cost. So if you are a politician who cares about budget management, you're likely to care about it well, precisely because you're investing a lot of money into the creation of this. The second is that you're likely to be under the guise of media and public scrutiny, because creating an executive department is going to be huge news for people on the ground. The fact that we're likely to already care a lot about Department of Education, right? You're likely to care about the Department of Agriculture and their different projects, means that you're under the public scrutiny, which means that you're likely have the pressure to do it well. But the third is that the proximity of the water issue problem in the Philippines, things such as flooding, things such as El Nino, things such as like the way we create dams that are environmentally destructive to people on the ground, means that this issue is likely to be very close to the hearts of people on the ground, which is why they're unlikely to just be very lazy of talking about it. The capacity is one. Obviously, these are technocratic groups, therefore they have they have like skilled capacities in their different disciplines. Second is that we have the capacity of internal audit through COA. But third is that we're likely to do private partnerships, because private companies like Ayala Water and Maynilad have a vested interest to work with the government in order to ensure that their projects and businesses go well. That's the interesting capacity. Yes, James.
Other departments have already been scrutinized through budget hearings and public optics, but corruption has still existed throughout the years, which means that there is a bigger obligation and bigger accountability measure that you need to introduce in the MEC.
Exactly. What we introduce here at MEC is that we enter a better accountability and chain of command system, precisely because there's now a point person who gets to answer to all of the water projects that exist in the Philippines. It's very difficult to catch corruption and status quo, precisely because the different departments simply point fingers at each other every time a mismanagement happens. One argument in this debate, which is that existing departments ought to be planned together because they're inherently interconnected as a water management bureau. The first premise of this argument is very simple. These three functions are inherently interconnected. So that is to say, sewage systems are connected with water resource management systems and dam systems, right? So this looks like waterworks projects such as dams, affecting the availability of irrigation for our different crops, as well as the water resources for people on the ground, things such as potable water, things such as the water that we use to take a bath and wash our car, right? These dams, so the creation of a project is inherently interdependent and interconnected towards each other. What this means is this creates a huge domino effect that in the worst instances creates a lot of disasters. Think about the Kaliwa Dam, for example, who's just likely to destroy the environment, who's likely to harm the urban poor in as much as you impound the water and you release it to Manila, for example, quite directly. And this is a result because of the fact that they're unable to communicate to each other precisely because there's no active reasons and there's no active mandate for them to be able to do so. And I posit that this is urgent precisely because the water problems in the Philippines are quite severe. Things such as El Nino, things such as flooding, things such as the inability to get potable water, for example, for people on the ground. The second premise of this argument then is that the current way that these departments are placed doesn't incentivize them to work together and maximize their potential. So one is that there's a chain of command problem. They're not mandated to work together because the way they perceive themselves is that they're mere independent bodies that can work absent each other, right? Because they territorialize, for example, they're like, if this is sewage, and this is my problem. If this is about dams and waterworks, and this is my problem. And it's about irrigation, it's their problem. That's the current ways of workings of these different departments, and it's disingenuous to the very nature of the fact that they directly affect each other. But even in the best case, where they work under big groups like the DPWH and DENR, they're likely to be secondary in the way you consider, for example, these kinds of things. So, for example, in DENR, you await, for example, the approval of NIA for you to approve a waterworks project in a certain protected area. So they're not the main consideration. Or in DPWH, where you're at the mercy of DPWH to get funding for things like irrigation and for things like drainage systems in highways. What this means is it manifests in projects that cancel each other out and are inherently mismanaged, which is the main problem that exists on side opposition. But comparatively, why is it better? And this is how I try to more directly answer James's POI. The first is you give these groups a clear chain of command, for example. So that means in terms of accountability and in terms of scrutiny, it's much better on our world because now it is easily attributable to who the faults come from, in as much as we have things like internal data and we have a clear chain of command of who's actually responsible for something. But the next is we get the benefit of shared resources with less transaction costs. So if they want to do collaborations on our world, we say that they can do it. It just comes at a high cost in terms of time and in terms of the ability to interconnect, because bureaucracy, for example, takes a lot of time for them to manage together. It's much easier in our world to have things like shared repo of databases in order to ensure which projects are more effective. But third is that we have things like foster partnerships, for example, and we get better projects in as much as we get to have a strategic planning that considers the different sectors of water management. Impacts. First, holistic multi-sectoral water projects that are better effective at solving the problem. But second is that we're able to cut waste. And then third is that we increase private confidence in investment and we get to center accountability, which is much better on Gov. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that speech, Prime Minister. Calling on the Leader of Opposition. Hear you.
Here. Am I audible?
Yep.
All right. Please badger me if I'll be robotic. So yeah, let me just set up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. We have to be clear. Sorry, I'm really sorry for that. My timer is lagging. It did not start. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. We have to be clear here, panel, and set the parameters straight. When do we create an executive department? This is a very important parameter in this debate. It comes in 3 competitive levels. Firstly, when the initiative stems from genuine intent and the implementing body has the capacity to manage extensive reforms, such as establishment of Department of Social Welfare and development of streamlined social services. But secondly, when current decentralized alternatives and agencies prove ineffective, like the formation of the Department of Energy in response to the energy crisis in the 1990s, for example. But second, when it aligns with the interests of an average reasonable Filipino, because this debate is on the lens of an average reasonable Filipino, when new department addresses practical everyday concerns such as the creation of the Department of Education to prioritize accessible quality of education. But Ben told us that the proposal is justified because there will be a budget hearing anyway, which leads to sustainability and better accountability measures at the end of the day. Firstly, this is untrue insofar as if you talk about sustainability, take a look, matatag curriculum was severely continued because having budget proposal do not directly resolve the issue of sustainability, most especially right right now that there's a degree of mistrust within the executives we have right now. That is why James POI is important, because the budget hearing do not guarantee or commensurate a streamline, plus no panel did not even prove why this is effective. This means adding another bureaucracy won't solve the problem of cost efficiency, time efficiency, and its sustainability, for example. But secondly, even there is a budget hearing, they are interconnected. This is exactly why they are interconnected. This only creates a red tape. If I'll be able to prove to you later on why this only creates an equitable access to water resources, then their first thing will be dismantled. What is then our counterfactual, and why? What do we want? A decentralized and LGU arbitrated system of water management. Firstly, access regions for the current water management system under LG units is not, for example, will be able to arbitrate these systems at the end of the day. But secondly, there will be consultation with Philippine local government, engage with local government representatives to understand challenges, resources, and constraints specific to their areas. Thirdly, allow local governments to implement targeted reforms based on their unique needs and practices. Fourthly, establish a regional monitoring system with variable oversight based on performance level, focusing more on underperforming regions, for example. Fifthly, develop infrastructure that enable regions to establish their own specialist water management agencies. And lastly, improve the capacities of regional agencies by strengthening their organizational structure, introducing stricter accountability measures to ensure efficient use of resources. Why this is likely to happen? 4 levels. 1, local governing bodies have natural incentive to enhance their performance since it's already direct impact to community and political credibility. But secondly, local government already have built-in accountability frameworks such as the commission audit and local checks and balances, which can be leveraged to ensure transparency and compliance. Thirdly, municipalities are required to draft and implement development plans that are monitored over decades, which provides a framework for tracking progress in water management. And thirdly, this counterfactual operates within the same constraint, making it cost-effective alternative to complete system overhaul by focusing only on regions of underperforming rather than revamping the entire structure. Why does the support of creation and executive department for water resource management in the Philippines is not principally justified? The intuitive bump here, this proposal is non-intersectional to begin with. 3 layers to analyze this. Firstly, the proposal originated from politician Ruben Padilla without sufficient data or research to support it, failing to account the diverse topography, geographical condition, and unique water management experiences of each region, which means this stems from malevolent intent and unreliable data coming from the dumb politician. But secondly, a centralized executive department would still require extensive proposal, numerous budget hearings, and ultimately lead to budget that is divided and arbitrated by the executive, potentially increasing financial constraint without guaranteeing effective resources allocation. But thirdly, the creation of a centralized department does not consider the varying capacities, resources, and strengths of each region, which makes it impractical given the geographical diversity across the Philippines. Why this is harmful then, panel? Firstly, the likely bureaucratic expansion will more likely to fuck up because the creation of a new executive department for water resource management could result in another bureaucratic layer that complicates governance without delivering real improvement. For instance, when the Department of Information and Communication Technology was established in 2016, it initially faced significant hurdles, including overlapping function with the other agencies under jurisdiction. But secondly, even if the department is established, centralized leads to slower response times due to extended decision-making process. If you take a look, the Philippines has been seen with National Irrigation Administration, where delays in project approvals and fund releases, for example, occur due to central oversight at the end of the day. But thirdly, a centrally appointed secretary will only favor certain regions, leading to unequal distribution because at some point, they are still beholden to the senator that appointed or executive that appointed, which means that there will be more likely inequitable access to these resources at the end of the day. But the question, panel, why then local government units should arbitrate this mechanism? There are 3 competitive levels to prove why this is better. Note that LGUs are the best arbiters of themselves because 1, these LGUs are the closest institution to local water resources issues, allowing them to quickly identify the response to these specific challenges, for example, which means they're more proximate to their problems. But secondly, they possess a comprehensive understanding to the local population, geography, and the development of urban planning, which enables them to craft tailored solution because they have already historical background as to how the urban development plan happens on their local government unit. But before I proceed, yes, go POI.
So if you want targeted policies, depending on cities, provinces, etc., we can have a Department of Water, Quezon branch, Los Baños branch, Santa Cruz branch on our side of the house. How is that any different?
It's different because one, in our side, it's a sliding scale. This is more arbitrated by the local government unit, as opposed on your side, you will still wait to the national budget and distribute it to other regions, which is more harmful, which I already proven to you earlier. But secondly, LGUs have inherent responsibility to their constituent under social contract, given their proximity and direct accountability and the local population. But thirdly, LGUs have flexibility and bargaining power among themselves to negotiate solutions and resources effectively, unlike central executive body, which may face bureaucratic constraints. The comparative discussion here is one, LGUs can address water management issues more efficiently because they are directly embedded with the communities they serve, unlike a centralized executive department, they can swiftly, without layers of bureaucratic approval, reducing delays in decision making at the end of the day. But thirdly, secondly, local government are better equipped to design and implement solutions tailored to their specific geographical, social, economic context. A centralized executive department will only impose one-size-fits-all policy that does not adequately address these diverse water management needs across different regions. Oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, Leader of Opposition. Calling on the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible and visible. Thank you.
All right, just give me a second. I will start a timer. I'll take POI's through voice. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think the problem of opposition right now is they never prove that the counterfactual that exists on their side is inherently exclusive in their model. Plus, the second one is that they just never build the incentive as to why LGUs will do this well. If you look at the first half of the LO speech, they suggest that a lot of times there are budget constraints that exist in the Philippines. It is unclear why a local LGU will just solve the water problem that exists within their own locality, insofar as a lot of water problems are often intersectional and quite big and quite, very, very expensive to solve. The first thing I would like to do is vibe check and just disprove a lot of the exclusivity of the alternative. The first thing that I want you to notice here, panel, is that when departments and national departments are set up in the Philippines, they usually create branches in different regions. Look, for example, the Department of Health. We have one national Department of Health, and we have other Department of Health that also exist in different regions of the Philippines, as well as the LGU that exists there. So it is unclear to what degree is this alternative likely exclusive. In fact, we suggest that it's worse on their side because LGUs have their own agency and have no streamlined system in order to operate. So perhaps if it's true that LGUs have an incentive to solve water, they don't do it properly precisely because there is no overarching mandate as to how you can do it properly coming from the National Water Department that exists on our side. So if it's true that LGU works, we think that it's likely maximized on our side, not on theirs. The second thing I would like to talk about is how this principle is just not true in this debate. What they suggest is that the principle should exist precisely because this should be an everyday concern and decentralize is something that is not enough. But if you look at Ben's analysis, we completely prove why decentralization is not enough. We show, for example, how the different departments create external harms for different departments the moment that they create these policies. So look, for example, how when they create dams, it hurts the irrigation department. When this irrigation department does something, it hurts the sewage department and therefore creates more flooding for people. But more than that, what we suggest is that the inherent decentralization of these departments often deprioritize water as a secondary issue. That is to suggest that because the sewage system's mandate is about sewage, right? They deprioritize, for example, how to manage water, how to streamline the flow of water in a lot of cities. But more than that, what we suggest here is that a lot of times the department heads of each different decentralized department that exists within the comparative also have the priority to fulfill their own mandate as we suggest. So for example, if you are in irrigation, you probably want to fulfill irrigation first and foremost, rather than talking about the other problems of water. So what that means is it's unlikely or it's uncertain for you to get clear and good funding to create meaningful water policies that exist in the comparative that they create. all of this shows and fulfills the standard of whether something is harmful or not. Clearly, this is harmful, and clearly it affects the everyday life of individuals when they cannot get access to clean water, when they cannot irrigate their farms, and therefore plunge into more poverty. We suggest that the creation is better for a lot of things. The first is that we streamline the command and the system that is created with how you manage water. This is good because you have now a centralized system to show the LGUs the kinds of frameworks that you have to implement in order to make water, or like to do the water better or something like that. But second, right, we suggest that we also have more capacity on our side, because on our side, this is the National Water Department. What that means is that the funds that is allocated to you is proportionally greater because you are part and parcel of that budget hearing. On their side, it is the whims of the department head that makes you want that gives funding for the water issues that we have. We think that in proportionality, we just make this better. There are 4 weighing mechanisms that I would like to do in order for us to win clearly within the comparative. The first is just the speed of collection of information. We suggest in the Philippines that water as a non-renewable resource faces a lot of problems. It is not just the depleting underground water that we have. It is also, for example, flooding. It is also, for example, the types of toxins and heavy metals that exist in different rivers. What we suggest is that the moment that you have a centralized system, it is easier for you to collect information precisely because you allocate a lot of these or other regional departments to give that information to you and create better, meaningful policies, and which means that there's unlikely to be any blind spots, and that's good for the people that consume that water. But more on that, we also suggest that there's also sustainability in how we create good quality policies. This is precisely because, like we suggest, because the chain of command is likely to be established, but more than that, because the budget that you have is just bigger, therefore you are more flexible with how you are able to tailor fit the kinds of policies that should exist within the Philippines. This is good because it offers faster relief for a lot of the water problems that exist in the Philippines. Less people are likely to suffer without water, but less people are also unlikely to consume lead and toxic water. Sure, the POI.
You're contradicting because Ben says the benefit of a Department of Water is that there's a streamlined chain of command and you can pinpoint one person. But if you're going to have localized departments of water, that's still susceptible to the same localized bureaucratic problems that you've posited.
So I don't know if you ever see an organized structure of the Department of Education, but here in UPLB, when you have the Department of Education, you will see the head, and then you will see the regional head of the pictures of the people, and which means that it's just not a clear line, but it's an organizational chart that exists with different lines, right? What that means is that the clear of accountability still exists because these regional people are still subsumed towards the national department head. It is unclear why people cannot see who is responsible or not. It's likely that the auditing is likely to be much better. And therefore, at this point, I would like to talk about corruption, right? Because if the main clash on their side is that bureaucracy exists and corruption exists, it's likely worse on their side. Because on their side, it is within the vested interests of its own department heads, from the sewage systems, from the irrigation systems, that pinpoints each other, that talks about like who is at fault, etc., etc. This makes the auditing and the accountability much longer and much constrained within the gridlock that exists within the kinds of politicking that exists because of the department heads not wanting to choose blame because they are the sewage, the irrigation, etc., etc. It is much worse precisely because you do not get any tangible resolution in their side. Very lastly, let's talk about the private-public partnership. What we suggest on our side is that private partnerships usually wants to collaborate with public partnerships because of their vested interest to manage things properly. We suggest that you make it harder on their side because of the inherent amount of logistics that you have to do. You have to transact, for example, with NAIA. You have to transact, for example, with the sewage system, etc., etc. We think that it's worse. More than that, because the water is a secondary issue for them. We think that we maximize this better when we have a streamlined amount of systems, when you have the national department system. And this is good because tech is needed in order to resolve water. You cannot just make water out of air. You need to have a lot of technology to do this. We make it better on our side.
All right, thank you very much for that speech, Deputy Prime Minister. Before we resume, I guess I just want to make a small reminder about the institutional code reviewing. So please be mindful of that in subsequent speeches and rounds, right? Thank you. All right, moving on to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
All right. POI is through voice because I can't see the chat. Um. Okay. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If water is currently a secondary issue, we wouldn't be having this debate because hearings wouldn't be, there wouldn't be talks about water. There wouldn't be discourse about creating the Department of Water. I think that the very reason why we're having this debate in the first place is precisely because we concede with government that water is an urgent issue right now. But where we delineate from them is that the solution isn't to create an executive department, but rather it's to strengthen the current departments and stick with status quo. I think the second reason why this principle cannot stand is because of the idea that government cannot just say that it is a secondary issue precisely because there are other issues that these departments are facing. Meaning, they can't say water is an urgent issue and then suddenly all other issues are deprioritized. I think the important note here is that the reason why water is sometimes seen as a secondary issue is because there are also other problems in the Philippines that are also faced by people on a day-to-day basis, or something that are faced by people in the regions, for example. On principle, government cannot say that it's an urgent issue, hence why we create an executive department. I think that first issue already falls. The second issue coming from government is they say water is a problematic issue, hence, but we believe that this is value neutral. I think the debate is about the solution that we're going to provide in order to solve the issue of water, and what exactly are the operational procedures as to how we're able to get more funding and get more accountability. And I'm going to provide that's more likely on our side in two arguments, right? The first argument is why funding cannot be something that government can win on in this debate. Government they say, oh, we make funding better on their side because they joined the budget hearing. There are three different responses to this. I think the first response to government is just to say that money doesn't just show up in the budget hearing just because there's a new department. Oftentimes, what happens in government, and this is something Ben concedes to, is that you take away budget from other departments, most likely from the DPWH, DNR, etc., etc. What this means is that in the best case in government, you don't get more budget, you don't get more funding just because you're there and just because you get to talk in the budget hearing. Most likely, it's going to be value neutral. The budget that you had before is something that you still get now, but that's the best case of government, which they never proved. Because I would argue that insofar as it's just value neutral, it's not like they don't get to talk about other issues, right? Just because there's no water PIC in the budget hearing. But I would posit that budget is significantly worse in government. And the reason for this is because your bargaining power is much worse because you hold much lesser projects than before. Your headcount is significantly less than before compared to when you were a sub-department of a much larger department, right? What this means is that your bargaining chip for a budget or a bigger budget is bigger on our side because you negotiate with the other sub-departments of the DPWH, of the NIA, right? So if there was a highway sub-department, for example, in the DPWH, and if there was a water department in the DPWH, you guys are able to combine your bargaining power. So you're able to, negotiate for a much bigger funding in the budget hearing. What this means is that the reason why this is so debate winning is because if the debate is about funding and whether or not we prioritize or deprioritize water, I would posit that you're more likely to deprioritize water in government in terms of budgeting, right? And the reason for that is because even in their best case, in which you are heard in the budget hearing, there is a new water PIC. Like, even if that's true, it's value neutral because money doesn't just show up. You're taking budget from other departments, which by Ben's definition, you take it from the very budgets, you take it from the very departments where you came from. But the second is that in the worst case and the more likely case is that you actually have lesser budget because your bargaining chip is much lesser in budget hearings. I think that's just the first argument as to why funding is much worse on their side. The second argument, and the more bigger argument for me, is just in terms of accountability, right? I just think that accountability is significantly better on our side. And if the debate is about the quality of works of people, of the department and of the government, I think that that's just significantly better on our side for three structural reasons. The first reason and the first thing that I want to point out is that in the best case of government, accountability is value neutral for two structural reasons. The first reason is because in either sides of the house, there will be a person in charge. The delta is that on their side, the person in charge is directly accountable to the executive body or goes directly to whoever is leading all the departments, right? On our side, it's directly under the DPWH, the NIA, etc., etc. There's a person in charge. But we would suggest that it's significantly better on our side. And the reason for that is because it's harder to point fingers to another department on our side of the house because you can't point a finger to yourself, right? If your project failed, for example, in government, I want you to imagine the budget hearing and what happens there, right? Because if a congressman asks the head of what Department of Waters and why his canals are so shit, for example, they can simply say, oh, the DPWH had built their highway badly on top of our canals, hence why our canals are so bad. The counter is that everyone is under one umbrella, meaning the person who built the canal, the person who built the highway on top of the canal, these two people are under the DPWH. So if one of them fucks up, we're able to blame the DPWH as a whole, and we're able to pinpoint where exactly in the DPWH is the fuck up, right? So if in terms of accountability, I think it's significantly better if Ben's problem is that people will start pointing fingers. It's significantly worse on their side because you point fingers in the budget hearing. In our side, we're able to pinpoint which departments are fucking up and then investigate where in that department is the fuck up. The second piece of structural reasons, but before I proceed, it's almost 6. Any POI?
It is hard to establish causality when you talk about water problems because often a lot of these water problems are intersectional. It is an intersection of irrigation, sewage systems. How do you identify the cause?
Okay. So this is actually my second structural reason, and that the water projects are directly intertwined with the projects of other departments, right? This is where I answered the POI. The reason and the principal reason why the DPWH holds water operations in canals, the reason why the DENR holds water operation in rural areas, and the reason why the NIA holds water operations in farmlands is because the water infrastructure is directly connected to their projects as well. Sure, Ben can tell you, oh, these people can coordinate with other departments. The problem there is two things. One, they have their own interests and have lesser incentives to negotiate with one another because they have different KPIs and metrics for success. Meaning the Department of Waters wants to build all the canals in the world. If the DPWH wants to build all the highways in the Philippines, for example, they are unlikely to negotiate with one another, or it's harder for them to do so when they're in separate departments with separate goals. But the second reason why structurally it's much harder is just because on frequency, right? You are different independent offices, so you meet less, you coordinate less because you're different departments with different goals. The reason why this is debate winning is because it proves to you that it's a logistical nightmare to add another department when all these projects are so intertwined with one another. The person in charge of the DPWH is in charge of the road, but the canal under it is in charge of the Department of Waters. Your projects are more likely to be shit because it's harder to negotiate, it's harder to coordinate, it's a logistical nightmare. If you want the Philippines to progress, side with up.
Thank you very much for that speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition, calling on the government whip. Here.
I will even charge phone to.
I can have the.
I'll just look for another timer. My phone did not charge. Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're on.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The first thing I'm going to talk about is where do we make better water policies? Because I think opposition tries to win on water policies based on a lot of different standards. They talk about nuance, talk about urgency, and I'm going to deal with those two things in this issue. Firstly, Gov talks about nuance and how a decentralized form of like water resource management is better because you're able to target proximate problems to different locations in the area. Leah already says that their counterfactual is not mutually exclusive. You can have regional branches of the Department of Water. You can have provincial branches. You have citywide branches as well. I think what option doesn't do is to deal with the trade-off that they will miss out on the synchronization of these various different agencies. What does this look like? At best, they can have DPWH Calauan branch, NIA Calauan branch, sewage system for Calauan branch, but they don't prove why these decentralized forms of agencies will necessarily collaborate with each other. They won't collaborate because they do not have a clear state-given mandate to meddle in other affairs, because the thinking of these different agencies is that I will only have to focus on irrigation, you focus on sewage distribution, etc., etc. But secondly, oftentimes the kinds of budget given to these decentralized agencies are also often proportional only to the nature of their projects. So if you, for the decentralized NIA in their side of the house in Calauan, for example, you only have a budget proportional to small-scale irrigation projects, well, therefore there's an active disincentive for you not to meddle with other people's affairs. So if opposition whip tries to state their case that these individuals have to coordinate with each other and synchronize, is very unlikely to happen on a structural basis. But thirdly, you have a collective action problem. If there is a problem that is outside irrigation, outside the water sewage system, and general things like flooding, there is no clear accountability mechanism, because often these things are not directly tied to like irrigation and sewage systems, etc. So on our side of the house, the comparative is that regardless of whether it's irrigation, flooding, or whatever, it is a Department of Water who answers to that. There is less background, there is less transactional cost, because it is clear that when it comes to water problems, it is a DW who must answer. But secondly, I want to talk about how opposition's case is reliant on the characterization that they will have a lot of these oversight boards and that they focus on underprivileged areas. Firstly, again, it's unclear why these oversight boards have any marginal value, insofar as often the kinds of oversight that they will do is often specific only to their individual functions. So yes, they might have an oversight board for irrigation, an oversight board for sewage systems, but they only oversee their specific functions as well. But secondly, if they agree that there are oversight boards, then it's unclear to me why corruption will happen, insofar as if they have the political capital to have a lot of these regulations, then surely we can also have the same kinds of regulations for the provincial level branches of the DW, as well as the central office of the DW and also the House. So it solves a huge bunch of their corruption and accountability issue from opposition bench. But secondly, even if we don't believe all the talks about nuance and we still miss out on that, the extension of LIA explains why we still have another pathway to victory in terms of improving better water policies. And this is something that DLO doesn't respond to. DPM says that even if you don't, DPM says that often the prerequisite for the private sector to be more confident in you in terms of partnerships and funding is that they first see that there is a clear management organizational structure they can talk to. The comparative in opposition is that when the private sector wants to donate and intervene and partner up, they have to go to a lot of processes. They have to align the schedules of the different agency heads of the DPWH, the NIA, the MWSS, etc., as opposed to our side, where all of the heads of these different subdivisions are already in one central office and they can collectively decide on things much faster. So it's easier for the private sector to invest and transfer technologies because there is ease of doing business on our side. What does this lead to? When it comes to problems of water policy or water problems, we can, for example, have things like greater desalination technology and durable cement to build dams. And these are things that are exclusive on our side of the house, because on their side of the house, they have to operate on the characterization that the Philippines has in the budget. On our side, we have capital infusion from the private sector as well. So even if you miss out on a lot of these things that the opposition gives you, which you already explained is not mutually exclusive, we still have another pathway to victory, which is technological advancement for the water sector. And we explain why this kind of intervention is necessary. From Ben, we explained that a lot of these water problems cripple a lot of people's daily activities, which is why we need to have technological advancement in these kinds of things. POI.
Why can't technological advancement be something decentralized? Because as you've argued, different types of regions will have different problems. In your side, you will be implementing the same technological advancement that won't be sensitive or intersectional to these different struggles.
Okay, first you have to explain why you have technology on your side. We explain that the mechanism for technological transfer on our side is the perception that there is ease of doing business with the Philippine government in terms of water policies. You don't have that when you have a decentralized form of an organization. Private sector will be disincentivized to working with you because there are a lot of transactional costs in terms of searching who they have to talk to. The next thing we're going to talk about is budget and corruption. Firstly, okay, I want to be clear about the comparative. In opposition, during budget hearings, it is the DPWH and the DNR who get specific budgets. The proportion of budget given to water is unclear and is decided internally. The response of DLO is that it is easier to negotiate internally and with your division heads. Not to say why it's easier. In fact, it is harder to do that because as Ben and Leah explains, a lot of these agencies are also multifunctional. So the DPWH also has things like highways, canals, aside from sewage systems. And so if they want to negotiate, it becomes unclear for you how to negotiate insofar as the main mandate of DPWH, for example, is infrastructure building. On our side of the house, you circumvent a lot of that uncertainty because on our side of the house, when the DU becomes a formal department, the state has to give them funding. We don't care whether this funding is big or small. What matters is the certainty, and that is better than what opposition can give. On their side of the house, they're reliant on the benevolence of your division head to give you funding. On our side, there's a state-mandated obligation that the DW should have funding in the first place. Secondly, about corruption. The corruption is not about whether it happens or not, but about how easy it is to conduct investigations. They don't deal with a comparative that is harder to point out fingers. It's hard to determine causality. When there is a water issue, it's hard to pinpoint whether it's the fault of the NIA, etc., because all of these things are intersectional. What changes on our side? One, you have one specific figure that you can call out. We don't care if corruption happens, because that can happen on both sides. What matters on our side is that it's easier to point out and resolve these issues. On their side of the house, you might have to go to a lot of eyewitness accounts. You might have to go to a lot of political, filibustering, for example, because they do not want to answer, because they do not have a clear answer. On our side of the house, when something bad happens, it is a DW executive head who answers. There's no uncertainty there. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, Government Whip. Calling on Opposition Whip. Here you
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, to both.
Wait, sorry, I still have the lecture background from a month ago. Let me just transfer to a stronger area or an area with a stronger Wi-Fi. Wait, sorry, give me a few seconds. Just tell me if I get choppy at any point. Maybe it's a bandwidth thing because of the camera. Or let me just turn it off just to be secured. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Government's case wishes to be a rushing river, but at least and at best, it's still water. The first reason why it doesn't move towards proving anything is because most of Ben's assertions to prove accountability are contextually been proven ineffective throughout the years of precedence. The Department of Education still had the capacity to corrupt and produce Sarah's book. And sure, she's being scrutinized now, but it's a reactive solution at best. The money was already stolen. That is why we become preemptive, and that is the delta at opposition. PhilHealth took insurance money, and we still don't know where the 10 million was. DPWH still has unfinished road projects in Cagayan de Oro. Probably you also have in your own cities. The importance and meta of this grounding is that government can meticulously build in a hypothetical procedure, but they fail in proving contextual effect or probability of effectivity in terms of realistic implementation and reflection. The second reason why Ben fails is because they do not offer anything new. And this is why the PY was important. Because Ben offers, there are budget hearings, scrutiny, and media transparency that incites public outrage. Both of these things panel already exists, but corruption still happens even with the budget hearing because they can get away by rerouting stolen taxes to supplemental funds that do not get scrutinized during the public hearing because they can get away by putting it in the previous administration's funding. But two, you also have confidential projects that gets justified after the budget hearing. So I don't know if you've already or you've heard a budget hearing, but this is what happens. But secondly, media accountability, really? The reason why it doesn't work is because people are so desensitized with national scale corruption, and it's just feels so impossible to overhaul that because you're going against stronger political dynasties on a national scale. And while Ben says water is important, but so is agriculture, because you might get thirsty without water, but you literally die out of poverty and without eating anything if the Department of Agriculture dies and becomes ineffective. But two, you might get dehydrated, but you'll also literally die without a job because Dolly failed. You know, you can't even buy that bottle of water. Let's deal with the difference in Delta. The difference is that, and let's say that corruption also happens locally. Number one, it's more consumable and likely realistic for people to feel like they can hold their local politicians and political dynasties accountable because they're localized, right? And likely their strength can be questioned on the propensity of the bailiwicks. But two, opposition candidates are just also stronger in localized areas. Take note, the only opposition party in the Senate is Risa Hontiveros, and you don't have any bargaining power to try to go against the majority vote. But number two, it's also just logistically easier as well, right? Because compared to the counterfactual of government, it's far easier to identify which regions have ineffective water systems and then target these regions and conduct the counterfactual from leader of opposition, which by the way, they just gaslight you into thinking was underbuilt from the Deputy Prime Minister. They were lazy at responding. The last Hail Mary from Ben is to say there's a chain of command. But other departments also have chains of command as admitted by DPM when we asked them a while ago, or when they asked us, have we seen how other departments work? It was a trap POI panel. Because if they admit that you'll eventually have to co-opt the system right now of how other departments work, you'll eventually lead to the same outcomes and to the same problems of corruption too. And this is a perfect segue to the second discussion of the extension from Deputy Prime Minister. They say it's non-exclusive. We can create local departments of water counterparts. Number one, this is weird because Ben says the benefit in the centralized streamlined bureaucracy is that there's one chain of command. And they can't just say, this is how other departments have worked before, because this could have been the only unique metric and meta of their mechanism, which they were unable to defend because they backpedaled. But number two, this also hits their new impact at WIP, which is technocratic or technology transfer. I'm unsure whether it's a new material, but I'm still going to bring this down because if the only metric to how you can do your techno transfer is the general private corporation feels like they can trust the national government, you do not get that benefit because from the answer from the POI a while ago, you're going to have local division counterparts of the department. So what really is it? Because if the private corporations have to deal with the local implementation from the bureaucracy of the division counterparts of the Department of Water, we're unsure whether that perception will last because they might have difficulties implementing and subluting, for example, localized implementation within the legislation of the local councilors. This is very important in debate winning because government is unsure. They're confused what the mechanism should have been, and we think they should have fought the harder fight. Let's say that it doesn't contradict, and we will eat their unmechanized, inconsistent discussion that the local division counterparts is justified. Number one, we ask, what's new then? Because if you're still going to allow some extent of arbitration locally, then it's still going to be susceptible to the same problems that you don't want to happen locally. But number two, let's say that the problems do not happen locally, and this is a debate-winning response. We think that the problem with the division or the counterparts they want to create is that the problem with that is that it lets go of Ben's discussion as to how you will absorb the local officers. And this is important because now we're unsure what really the mechanism is. Because if you're going to create a new division of water or Department of Water, it's so hard to absorb the current individuals within different offices because they're the same people you probably want to hold accountable. And this is important because this means you have to build infrastructures for the new department to operate. You have to hire new people. You have to create new bureaucratic processes in project proposals. You have to create accountability measures, which they just say is auditing in the current system. I think that these things are important because they do not have a delta in this debate, and I'm pretty sure we're going to win this round. What is government's, take note, there wasn't a POI, so the speech is perfect. What is government's best case? Let's say that it works. And this ignores all the discussion from Steven as to how the current proposal was literally made by Robin Padilla, who did not research it or even statistically ground the claim the proposal wasn't even a bill in the first place. But number two, this also ignores all of the extension discussion from Philip as to how there are bureaucratic preferences and the counterfactual, which they never really brought down. I think that the problem with this overhauling system and reform is that one, it becomes a precedence to all other problems that we will encounter. So you will create a department of culture, a department of cell phone, a department of whatever event and problem we might encounter in the future. And the problem with this is that it doesn't solve the local issue to why these things eventually lead to a bigger scale on the national discussion. I think that these things are important to take note of because now the corruption within the national scale is so hard to overhaul because they probably have entrenched every single liberties and right that you need in order to live. So it's harder for them to overhaul corruption if it exists in both sides. What is our worst case? And we win by meta because they didn't do this. In the event where you aren't synchronized, and this is the harm from government whip, we're fine with that because you cannot be synchronized given the variances in topography, geography, admitted by government whip, difference in problems that might be encountered. So if the problem in CDO is that our corruption has entrenched so much to the point where we weren't even able to pay 10 million for the past 5 years, and then the problem in Davao is that they're landlocked, and then the problem in Cebu is that they have still water and they have like scarce resources. I think that we're fine that we're not synchronized because we are experiencing these problems at different phases and are fixing them differently as well. With all of these reasons, we win.
Thank you very much for that speech, Opposition Whip. Calling on Opposition reply.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
All right, starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There are 3 issues as to why opposition clinches the debate. The first is just on the principle that Ben introduces and why urgency is something we're able to co-op on our side and why their side is a logistical nightmare. Ben's framing is that water is an urgent issue right now. Never mind that we already proved that A, it's every other issue right now that the government faces is urgent. That doesn't necessitate us creating an entirely new department. Never mind that we're able to prove that even if it's an urgent issue, you're able to solve it even if it's under the DPWH, the NIA, etc., etc. The reason why it's important is because government whip was unable to respond to the constructive speakers coming from opposition. And that is to say, we told you that we concede. We concede that this problem is urgent. But the problem is that they don't win on that standard because we proved that on their side it's a logistical nightmare and operations is just hard to do. Bureaucracy is much worse in their side. Because sure, you have the person who makes the canal and the person who makes the irrigation system under one roof as to what government whip tells you. But the person who makes the road on top of the canal and the person who purchases the land to make your irrigation system is in another department. So I want you to imagine, panel. Imagine in opposition's world, the person who makes the highway, the person who makes the canal, who purchases the cement for both, the person who coordinates for both, are all under the DPWH. They're all under one roof. They're able to coordinate frequently. They're able to hold each other accountable if they don't stop if they stop working. In government, the person who makes the highway is from DPWH. The person who makes the canal is from the Department of Waters, right? Like it's just really confusing. And in fact, and the reason why this is so debate winning and the reason why it's so important to flag this right is because government whip was unable to respond to the logistical nightmare case coming from DLO, and that's fundamental for them to be able to champion the idea of how they're able to solve the water problem as faster on their side. The reason why this is so debate winning is for 2 reasons. One, if the debate is on urgency and that people right now are dying from thirst, the bureaucracy is much worse on their side because it's harder to coordinate. It's harder to get people to gather and meet. The process is just much longer. Never mind that you're creating a completely new department from scratch and the problem is already existing now. And as per what Ben tells you, it exists in a timeline. Never mind that, right? Even if it's already fully fixed tomorrow, the problem is that the process is just much longer and it's just much messier. But the second reason why this is so debate winning is if the debate is on funding and getting private enterprise to invest in you, which is, by the way, what government whip tells you, they aren't likely to invest in you if the process is longer and more uncertain because that means that it's gonna be more costly for you and it's going to be more unattractive to private investment. So you lose all the tech investments that government whip tells you is so exclusive on their side. Meaning, if the debate is about accountability, about urgency, about funding, they already lose the debate. But let's clinch the debate more. If the debate is about accountability, I think that's significantly better on our side, because on our side, the accountability is more top-down, but it's more targeted, right? Meaning, in opposition's world, you can pinpoint the department that needs investigation and then investigate internally. The counterfactual is that people can point fingers at each other because their projects are so intertwined. By the way, something GovWhip was unable to respond to. That's debate winning because it proves that accountability is much worse, because people are going to be fighting in the budget hearing. It's harder to investigate two separate departments as to who really fucked up. So if accountability and like urgency is the issue, we win. But let's clinch the debate more, just to prove that up wins. If the debate is about getting local branches and a more nuanced approach to be able to solve these problems, we told you that local branches exist on our side. They say it's value neutral because they can also have like a Cagayan de Oro Department of Waters or whatever. But if that's the case, they have the same people, the same budget, the same system. All the problems right now exist on their side as well. But the clincher and the reason why opposition wins is what James tells you. Who gets to join the negotiating table? Because on our side, it's the LGU plus the local DPWH, for example. On their side, it's the DPWH, the LGU, plus the Department of Waters, which, by the way, has to get approval from the national executive because this is an executive department. The bureaucracy is more. It's less nuanced and there's less accountability. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, opposition reply, and calling on government reply. Attend the debate.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. First observation I'd like to make is that they only respond to the first speaker of our team. Our team is not just Ben, it is also Leah and Francis. Second is that they heavily backload their responses. If they wanted to have a more genuine debate, James should have given his responses to Philip so that we have time to respond to them. And as much as they cannot respond to their responses, I think it is unfair for them to be credited the clincher. But next, it is unclear what their counterfactual is and why it's realistic. And I note that this is the biggest reason why they have to lose this debate. Note that they should have just defended status quo, and that's what their burden to be is. But inasmuch as Steven comes into this debate and gives us an unrealistic counterfactual about decentralized water management, then that's what they have to already defend. And they fail to do this. We have three questions to their counterfactual. One, how does a decentralized system manage water? We think that it is water mismanagement system. But second is, what is the capacity of these LGUs to be able to do this well? If the frame is true on both ends of the debate, that there are budget constraints to be able to create projects on the ground in the Philippines, then it's unclear where the quality of the projects that they get is one that is more nuanced, more sophisticated, and better. But third is, how is this likely to be good? We posit, coming from Leah, that you probably are likely to create things like Tragedy of the Commons on your world, where the LGU of Bae wants to create a highway over Laguna de Bay, but LGU of Calamba doesn't want that because it's unsustainable to the environment. That is why, even if they say, oh, well, you have the same problem, even if we have local branches on our world, the difference in the clincher is we have a level of accountability and directive that allows them to follow a common meta-narrative on how they should manage water projects. That is why, even if there are local branches in our world, it is one that is still managed better on their world. If they have local branches, it's tantamount to anarchy. But by burden fulfillment, this means that we already not just win this debate, but win this debate by a huge margin. It proves that their counterfactual is not just unrealistic, it's inexclusive and much, much, much worse. First issue then, I want to then create the first non-issue on this debate, which is intent. Because they try to say, well, this was created by Bato and this was created by Robin Padilla. But this debate is about supporting the creation of a water department, not supporting the creation of a water department created by Robin Padilla, right? It is unclear why this has to be the metric of the debate and why we ought to debate the debate in the way that they wanted it to be. We say that even if that is the case, right, we gave structural analysis in framing on why it's likely to be created well and why there's likely to be levels of accountability and criticism that's unlikely to feather the worst kinds of harms that they want to talk about. The next issue that I want to talk about, which is the real issue, is on management, on accountability. Because again, the main thing that they want to talk about is that one call out is they still haven't proved a better system of accountability that exists on their world, right? They say it's decentralization, but we posit that intuitively that creates lower accountability systems because now you fragment the system more. The comparative on our world is much, much better because if there are faults that exist on our ground, there's a clear person in charge that gets to talk about what is actually going wrong. And one is that we prevent those disasters from happening precisely because of the ability for them to intermingle and work together. But DLO and Philip gives this weird argument about DPWH and canals. We say that even if it is going to be the Department of Water handling the canals, it's fine because the analysis from government is at least they have better expertise and accountability and ownership over the project because DPWH is Department of Works and Highways, not Department of Works, Highways, and Canals, right? It's unclear why it's better on their world. But more importantly, they still don't deal with the strongest impacts that are unresponded to from government. First is the ease of doing business. So precisely because it's now easier for these departments to do business for each other, we increase the amount of them to work together and to create more interdisciplinary projects. But second is shared resources. And this is argued that first, not Francis. That's why you have to credit it. We get better technology because we allow better tech transfer. But more importantly is that you have to respect the interdisciplinary, intersectionary nature of water projects. They say, well, synchronization is bad because we don't want Cagayan to synchronize their water projects with Manila. That is not the case. It is about managing these systems well to ensure that they don't overflow and create negative externalities against each other. Dams, irrigations, and waterways and sewage are the ones we have to orchestrate to create a central plan among together. By the end of the debate, this is an obvious gov ballot.
Thank you very much for that speech, government reply, and thank you everyone for an excellent debate. Please cross the house and give us 15 minutes.